So hi, welcome to Inaccurate Reviews. This is Tyler from Inaccurate Reviews. A while back, I made an analyzation of a graphic novel based on Bela Lugosi. It was specifically a biography about him, and I talked about the inaccuracies with that related to the Universal monster movies. However, there was something that recently came up that was brought to my attention. There's a mini-series out right now on the VIX streaming service called And They Arrived at Night. It's based on, or at least inspired by, the making of the Spanish version of Dracula. So I sat down and watched it, and within just the first episode, I was just frustrated watching this thing because there are so many inaccuracies just within the first episode. And I've watched the rest of the series, and it doesn't really get any better in terms of being more accurate historically. And the thing is, yeah, the show in itself is entertaining when it comes to just how the characters bounce off each other with their personalities and the acting. But my biggest issue with the show, obviously the miniseries, is that it's just so historically inaccurate. Every episode, or just about every episode, is riddled with inaccuracies. And this has come from someone like myself who loves the Universal monster movies, and I've written a book about the Universal monster movies. You can check it out right now in places like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iBooks, in hardcover print and digital. So the thing is, I'm really strongly passionate about this subject. So I watched this whole entire show, and I just wanted to analyze and mention everything that this really got wrong, just blatantly gets wrong about the making of the Spanish version of Dracula. So on episode 1, the first thing they got wrong is the fact that it was not Carl Laemmle Sr.'s idea to do a Spanish version of Dracula. It was actually the idea of producer Paul Kroner, who was in love with a woman named Lupa Tover, who was an actress, and at the time she wasn't so sure if she was going to make it in the industry and thought about moving back to Mexico, and he was pondering at night, how am I going to keep this woman around that I'm in love with? So he ended up pitching to Laemmle Sr. the idea of making a Spanish version of Dracula by recycling the costumes and the sets from the English version. And they would shoot at nighttime as the English version would shoot at the daytime. And speaking of the Laemmles, they kind of treat them as kind of airheaded, like they just won the lottery and just created a studio just by lucky chance. And the thing is that you can't be that incompetent to build such a movie studio like Universal, which is the longest lasting movie studio in American history. And I know it's a comedy, they're trying to make funny stuff, but the fact they do this, and also they portray Carl Laemmle Jr. as kind of overly much a daddy's boy, and it just felt like mildly kind of a hit piece on the Laemmles, in my opinion. I don't know, I gotta ask my friend Antonia what she thinks about it, because these are our relatives. One of the things that the show got right was the fact that it was true that the movie was thought to be lost for a long time until a negative was found in Cuba. And if you watch the movie nowadays, you're most likely going to find it attached to the Blu-ray and 4K releases of Dracula with Bela Lugosi as a bonus feature. I know it's not related to the Universal monster movies, but I'm a fan of the Three Stooges, and there's a moment where they mention, are you a fan of Three Stooges? Do you watch the Three Stooges? But the thing is that this takes place in 1930, when they filmed both the English and Spanish versions of Dracula. The Three Stooges, in terms of their serial shorts from Columbia Pictures, didn't start until 1934. But again, this is one of the many examples of the show playing fast and loose with history. I get why they changed it from Universal Studios to Royal Studios, probably because to avoid copyright with that, and that's something I was fine with, whatever. In the show, they describe it as Lupa Tover is struggling to get the part. In reality, she got the part pretty easily because the man that was in love with her decided to make this movie to keep her around so he can try to romance her, and which of course he succeeded at. They eventually fell in love and they got married, and they were married for many years. When they do the recreation of Dracula in his castle for the first time in the Lugosi version, we see Dracula's bride serving food, which never happens in the movie. If you've seen both the English and the Spanish versions of Dracula, the brides of Dracula, or his wives specifically, do not serve food in that scene. So that's just factually incorrect. When it came to the Spanish cast of Dracula, they did a good job in terms of casting, but when it came to some of the people involved with the English version, they really did miss the mark. I mean, the guy playing Bela Lugosi doesn't look that much like him. I've seen impersonators at the Universal parks that look more accurate to Lugosi than this guy. And then Todd Browning, the director of Dracula, this looks nothing like Todd Browning. And then look at the actor playing Dr. Seward. He's like way too young. Oh, and then by the way, they enter Soundstage 15. In reality, Soundstage 12 is where they filmed this scene in the movie. It was the same soundstage where they also shot part of Frankenstein, and they also, about 10 years later, would film the forest scenes in the original Wolfman from 1941. But this is only episode 1, so trust me, there is a lot more episodes where there is more historical inaccuracies, so let's go. When it comes to playing fast and loose with history, again, they portray some of the people, which I don't know exactly close to their personal lives with these people who they were, but they portray the producer Paul character as sort of a wimp who is easily anxiety-filled, or or that the director of the movie, George Milford, was someone who had gambling problems and would constantly keep getting beat up by members of the mob, which, again, I'm not so sure if that really happened. I couldn't find anything about that. I just found that just kind of forced way to kind of pad up the runtime and just add more unnecessary comedy into the mix. There's also a romance struck between the actor who plays Renfield and then the actress who plays Lucia, which I don't know if this really happened or not. There's also this bizarre subplot involving the actress who played one of the nurses in the movie, that she's speaking incoherent Spanish and that she's trying to place a curse on the entire production, which again is just really forced padding up the runtime, and it's not even really that funny. But I think the elephant in the room, of course, is the portrayal of Carlos Ruelas. Now, I don't know how much was exaggerated for the purpose of comedy, but they portrayed Carlos as someone who was just temperamental and hard to work with and constantly threatened to quit, which I don't know how true that is or not, because from what I've read, the production on the Spanish version of Dracula went fairly smooth. In fact, they were pretty much going at a faster rate filming this movie compared to the English version of Dracula. One of the oddest casting choices would have to be the guy who does the cinematography in the Spanish version of Dracula. They cast a Hispanic man to play this guy. However, in reality, the man who did the cinematography on this movie was George Robinson, who was a white man and would later go on to be a cinematographer in many more Universal monster movies. There's a moment, of course, where Carlos is speaking to the mirror multiple times saying that he is Dracula, which of course this is what Bela Lugosi did many times, although I don't know if Carlos did the same thing. There's a moment in which they're trying to steal this certain special camera where they can operate a kind of an interesting kind of crane shots for the movie that we see. But the thing is that I doubt that they went out of their way to steal this thing, since the fact that they also use a similar camera in the English version of Dracula, specifically the scene in which they're on the winding staircase towards the end of the movie in which Dracula kills Renfield. In episode 3, they portray Dracula and Renfield in the ship, which is true, we see that in both the English and Spanish versions of Dracula, but neither version has the wives ever going on the journey to England, because that never happens in either version. Another thing they got wrong when it came to dramatizing or recreating scenes from the Spanish version of Dracula was showing that Dracula's first introduction was in the Seward home. In reality, it was at the opera scene, which of course was the same in the English version of Dracula, and it happened to be the same soundstage 28, aka the Phantom Stage, in which this happened. In episode 4, there is a dramatization of a scene that did not exist, where Eva and Lucia look inside this coffin. This does not happen in the movie whatsoever. In fact, Lucia dies roughly around the same time, timeline-wise, as Lucy did in the English version of Dracula. Another dramatization they get wrong is the fact that they go to the sewer sanitarium to talk to Renfield behind bars, but obviously this is very fictional and did not happen in the Spanish version or in the English version of Dracula. Also, they do show a romance blossoming between Paul and Eva during the making of the production of this movie. However, in reality, it wasn't until much later, towards the end of filming, or a little bit afterwards, that Lupa found out that Paul had feelings for her, and she was saying that she was basically the last to get the hint. So in episode 5, they get the production date wrong for a scene in the English version of Dracula. They say it's in August 8th. In reality, Dracula didn't start production until September 29th, 1930. Then there's a moment where we see the Hollywood sign in the background, or specifically at the time, it was called Hollywood Land. This is geographically impossible. Universal Studios is behind the hill where the Hollywood sign faces. I know this because I was in Los Angeles last year on a vacation. There's a scene when Juan Harker is groveling to Dracula inside Carfax Abbey, at least as it was supposed to be, but obviously it's the same set for the castle set. Again, this scene never happened in the movie, in either the Spanish version or the English version. It's like, did these people even watch the movie that this is supposed to be inspired by? They described that the English version of Dracula was going over budget.
English Dracula is going over budget, you know. Junior is my kid, but he's a disaster. But you know what you're doing.
While it did go over schedule, it was actually under budget. There's this really bad plot twist where it's revealed that Paul is secretly engaged to Mary Fiblin. In reality, these two were engaged at one point, but that was back in the 1920s, and they could never get married because Paul was Jewish and Mary's Catholic family would not allow it. So these two were not together by the time that Paul had the interest in Lupa. In episode 6, they described the production to be a cursed production. In reality, the production of the Spanish version of Dracula went fairly smoothly. In fact, they were going pretty much ahead of schedule compared to the English version of Dracula. One of the most idiotic things I've seen from this whole entire miniseries is the fact that they have the original director of the movie taken away, and they have this woman directing the rest of the movie. This is pure revisionist history, and you thought that like Howard Zinn was scummy for doing that? This could really teach Howard Zinn a thing or two. There's never been a woman who directed any of the classic Universal monster movies. There have been plenty of women who've acted in front of the camera, of course, for the Universal monster movies, and even some women who worked behind the scenes, but there was never a woman that directed any of the Universal monster movies. That is a fact, and this is just factually incorrect. It wasn't enough that they had to get the recreations wrong throughout this whole entire miniseries. They're just purposely doing revisionist history on this. I know it sounds like I'm going a little bit on a rant here, but this is just pure lying to your audience. In episode 7, they portray the actor playing Professor Van Helsing, who was played by Eduardo Arzamna, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that he died during the making of this production. In reality, this guy didn't die until 1951, so how this guy died 21 years before he actually died in reality is just beyond me. Also, they show like the Draculas, both Bela Lugosi and Carlos Varela's, having like a sword fight and like a fire breaks out. Where is this coming from? I know it's a comedy, but why even have this? This is just pure filler and again padding up the runtime. And again, what I said earlier about playing revisionist history, just flat out lying to your audience, there is a final scene in the movie where they have Lucia being the one that kills Dracula. She dies in the movie, okay? In fact, Professor Van Helsing and Juan Harker are the ones who kill Lucy in her crypt before they go to kill Dracula. How is this even possible? Then they also show Dracula being staked in the heart on screen with blood. We don't see that in the movie, or even the one with Bela Lugosi. And then when Bela Lugosi congratulates the people who made the Spanish version of Dracula, it is true that Bela Lugosi did like the Spanish version of Dracula, but then when he's introducing his so-called girlfriend Velma, I looked into this and it appears that Bela Lugosi never dated such a woman. And it is true that Universal briefly did consider a Spanish version of Frankenstein, but this never happened because the Spanish version of Dracula wasn't as profitable as they thought it was going to be, and they decided they're going to focus on just the English-speaking versions of these movies. I know it's supposed to be a comical moment of a last laugh kind of thing, but Carlos Varela's was not deported, especially not after the premiere of Dracula. Okay, why? Why is this whole series just flat out lying? It's like either they are just willfully ignorant and never did their research on this thing, or they're just saying, history is what I want it to be. And I hate that. I know when it comes to various other movies or a mini-series that's based on a historical event, and I know that they change things here and there, or maybe they simplify things for the average viewer, but the thing is that I am a diehard fan of the Universal monster movies. I know a lot about this history, and it was just so frustrating just watching this thing and being like, that's a lie, that's BS. It was just so constant throughout this whole series that I know that people are enjoying this, and I get that, but the thing is that if you know about the actual making of this movie or the history behind just this one in the Universal monster movies, it is just an F grade in terms of historical detail. It's just flat out wrong in every way imaginable. The acting was good from the cast. I did like how it was shot and put together, but yeah, just the writing was atrocious. So there's my opinion and what I thought about the making of the Spanish version of Dracula, or at least this miniseries, this dramatization of it. But if you really want to read about what really happened during the making of this movie, then I highly recommend reading my book, 100 Years of Universal Monster Movies, or at least a chapter on the making of the Spanish version of Dracula. So anyway, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and happy Halloween.